Hey friends, in this video we're going to paint that village that we began drawing on the previous video. I'm starting by making the paper wet using my brush. I'm using a fairly large quantity of water. This is something that you really need to figure out on your own. I struggled a lot with how much water should I use, and it's really hard in the beginning. What I'm doing now is adding the watercolor into the wet water that's on the page, and you can see that it sort of spreads around because of that. This is a good technique to fill in large spaces when you want to get a fairly even spread of the color, which has some random textures in it. I used a blue and now I'm adding a bit of purple. Don't worry too much about these specific colors if you're trying to draw this as well and paint it as well. You can basically use whichever colors that look nice to you. You can try and imitate what I'm doing, but colors is something you really need to experiment with and see what works. I like this combination of blue and a bit purple. Sometimes I'll add a bit of orange as well. I'm using a dry brush now, clean and dry brush, to sort of blend the outer edges of the sky. Not really a must, but I wanted to do it this time. I will soon mix some tones for the buildings themselves. Beginning from left to right as well. I try to keep this method of working from left to right, because that way I make sure I don't smear ink, I don't smear paint or anything. I erase some of the pencil lines. Sometimes I don't even use pencils, so there's no need for this step. And sometimes I just leave the pencil lines. It can all look good. The color actually comes and sort of obstructs the pencil. You don't even have to do that. Now I'm mixing a color. I'm sorry if this is a bit boring, you don't actually see me doing this, but soon I'll begin actually coloring this. I'm using a combination of brown and blue tones to create this gray interesting tone for the building here, color. And I accidentally colored the side of the window, so I just cleaned that up a bit. Just about this color specifically, and colors in general, I noticed, I watched a few videos to learn this and read a few articles that basically, what I'm doing now is using a dry brush to get the excess color that I had here. I used a lot of color. So basically, colors. When you mix colors that are complementary, meaning on opposing sides of the color wheel, what you get is a sort of a brown tone that contains both. So in this example, I used the blue and sort of orange-brown thing, which are, as you figured, complementary colors on both sides of the color wheel. And what this causes is to have this interesting brown-gray tone that I got here. The second building I used, I think, yellow ochre to color it. Just applied a very thick layer of the color. It almost didn't have water in it. I wasn't necessarily planning to go that dark with the color, but it's just what turned out. And this building, I actually took the color I used for the leftmost building and added some green to it. It's called, I think, sap green. You really need to experiment with this and see what works for you. I like to try combining different colors, but you will notice that many colors don't just look weird together, so you kind of, let's say in terms of colors for this specific painting, I didn't get the exact results I wanted. Something was a bit off. I think I'm missing a bit of contrast, but you'll soon see. But yeah, it's something that you learn how to work with, and in this example I also tried some new things, so I wasn't really sure about the result. So that's why it may have turned out a bit not exactly as I wanted, but it's okay. So now I'm using that same yellow ochre for this building. You'll notice that for the top building, the sky sort of went through the line of the building, which is fine. I think these sort of mistakes add some grace to the drawing. And if you're working on something like a painting for a client and you really want to be super accurate, yeah, you can be careful and make sure no color goes outside of the lines, but you know, mistakes are inevitable sometimes, and you can always correct them, add a second layer, sort of do some lifting, which I haven't explained yet. I may explain in a future video, which is basically it's a set of techniques that are used to lift some of the color without destroying the drawing, basically. Now for the buildings on the right, I'll use some sort of brown or sort of brown gray green tones. They're a bit, this is the color they actually had in the original image I used as reference. Also notice that I don't paint the left side of the buildings at all. If you remember in the previous video, I explained that I don't even draw the details of the roofs on them. The reason I don't do that is that they are reflecting the light so strongly that you can barely see the details. So if I will paint them, it'll be using a very bright tone of, I think, red, or sort of a burnt sierra, I think it's called, burnt sienna. Yeah, so I said sierra. What is that? Anyway, so now I painted all the buildings. We can move on to the foliage and the left side of the buildings, and adding some of the shadows under the roofs, under the windows. So first, yeah, I'm starting with the burnt sienna, coloring all the roofs. Now, something interesting that happens here. This color is actually sort of a reddish brown, but it's much closer to brown if you look at it. Now in this specific painting, it looks more red, and I think this is created due to the contrast with the other colors and the sky especially. So it's not really a red color. If you'd see it in a different context, you may have just saw it as brown, but which is more closer to what it is. But in this example, it sort of looks red, and the reason, yeah, it's because of the contrast with the cool colors, like the blues and the greens on the building on the right, and on the building, the tallest building, and even on the left building. Now here I made a small mistake, I think. I didn't really want to, yeah, I'm cleaning it using a tissue as much as possible. I didn't really want to paint the side of the building, just the roof. So now, as I said, I'm using a very bright red. It's actually the same burnt sienna, just very bright, using a lot of water in it. The more water you add, the brighter the color becomes, the weaker its color is. The weaker it appears to be. Now we're beginning to work on the trees. Actually, this is interesting. I'm combining here brown and green, and I'm alternating between the two. So now you'll notice I'm placing some green color, and now I'm going with a bit of a brownish color, and then I may go back to the green, and it sort of blends in together very nicely. As long as the color is wet, you can put another color or connect another color to it, and they'll sort of merge together. For example, below you see that I just added another brown-green tone, and it really didn't blend to the top, it just stayed there. But here you can see the color I'm adding right now perfectly blended with the brown. And yeah, exactly where I went now with the brush. Below that gate at the bottom. And now I'm doing a nice effect of just squirting some of the color on the paper. It looks nice sometimes the way I do it. Now, actually, I'm not very pleased with how the trees turned out here. I wanted them much darker, so I will probably go back with a second layer of brown and some green again. You can layer watercolors. You can use a large number of layers, but you do need a good paper to support that. And oh cool, there's a bird just outside my window now staring at me. You do need to have quality paper to be able to use a lot of layers and a lot of water without the paper buckling too much. For this drawing, I'm actually using a relatively cheap sketchbook, but it is specifically meant for watercolor, so it makes it function better when using watercolors. But this is also something you can experiment with, because there's also what's called mixed media paper, and I know that not a lot of people recommend using mixed media, but I actually like it. I get good results with it. Many of the drawings I like the most and the paintings I like the most I got when using the mixed media ones. So you really need to experiment with it. But you do need a thick paper if you want to support a lot of layers and wetting the paper a lot to create skies and big washes of color. So yeah, now I'm going back with more green. It didn't feel green enough for me, and it wasn't dark enough. So adding a second layer will sort of add like a translucent mask of green to it, so it will make it a little bit darker. And now I'm doing something interesting that I learned recently. I just thought I'd try it. I painted those buildings in a reddish tones, so now I'm actually going back with a blue and going over the warm layer with a cooler layer, with a layer of blue, because it felt too much, it felt too warm for me, the entire drawing. The only contrast there is with the sky, which is nice, but still it was kind of, too red and orange and burnt sienna. It was too much. I wanted to sort of even it out. And it's actually a nice trick to sort of shade using cool colors, even if what you're shading is warm. For example, this is something I didn't really do here, but the diagonal shadows on both the building, the yellow building on the left, the big one, and on the bottom building on the left. So I just used the diagonal line to indicate where the shade is, and I used another red tone. This is something I could have done better, perhaps using actually a cool color. Now I'm going back and really bringing out the shadows under the roof. The roofs are protruding a bit outside of the more out of the walls, so there is this sort of shaded area between them, which is important to indicate. And here in this building I didn't indicate it at all, so I will add it. And now it's actually blue again, so I am using some blue to shade the warmer colors as well, which can create again a nice contrast here. And finally, going back with this brown, darker brown layer just over the trees to create a stronger contrast with the buildings. There are two things happening here. The trees are at the foreground, so they can be a bit darker and stronger. And I do want to create that contrast, regardless of the fact that they're in the foreground. And so I really need to use a darker tone here. I think I could have gone much darker than this. I'm just adding some of there's this sort of wall here, and I'm gonna blur it out a bit by cleaning and drying the pen. And yeah, that's basically it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've missed part 1, you can click the annotation, and I'll talk to you soon.